For Fredericton.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I wish to acknowledge the unceded Wolastoqiyik territory from which I speak today and the immense privilege I carry as a settler in this land. I would like to begin by extending my deepest condolences and to send strength to all who will be re-traumatized by this new and devastating information regarding the realities of Indian residential schools in Canada. The remains of 215 children have been found buried on the site of a former residential school in Kamloops, BC. Using ground-penetrating radar, confirming what families and communities have known but could not substantiate until now. This new knowledge is truth. We need to confront our past and our present with truth before we can even build reconciliation. I remember when I was first introduced to the concept of residential schools. It was during my post-secondary studies, largely on my own and in conversations with family and friends. It was not taught to me in school. We only learned that Canada is a land of peacekeepers and apologetic people whose brave pioneer ancestors defied the odds in a barren land to build the country we have today. We have worked very hard to erase the history and culture of Indigenous peoples. We have also worked very hard to erase the people themselves, as well as the evidence of these crimes. Prime Minister Harper's historic apology was largely in response to a mounting potential litigation as rumors and horror stories became all too real, with well-documented acts of genocide bubbling to the surface. Yes, genocide. Not simply cultural genocide, preventing language and tradition from flourishing, but the United Nations definition of genocide. From the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, Article 2 of the United Nations, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. A, killing members of the group, like throwing a child down a flight of stairs or out a third-story window, as outlined in Isabel Knockwood's incredible novel, Out of the Depths. B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, like separating children from their parents and communities, like threatening those who witness abuse with the same fate, like force-feeding expired food, shaving sacred hair, and stripping children of their given names and mother tongue, as so many experiences across the country have documented. C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, like deliberately exposing children to fatal diseases and being proud enough or brazen enough to take photos and share them in textbooks for years to come in celebration of the efforts undertaken to address the Indian problem. The problem, of course, in Canada was their existence. D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, like forced sterilizations, forced abortions, and infanticide, targeting specific family bloodlines, like those of hereditary chiefs or strong leaders. E, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. And sadly, Madam Speaker, we see this continue today, with more Indigenous children in care today than they were enrolled in residential schools at the height of their operation in Canada. There were schools in almost every province and territory in Canada. New Brunswick likes to gloss over this fact, but we too had institutions where children were treated like animals or worse, and parents were stripped of their rights right here in our backyard, simply before Confederation, so Canada washed its hands of accountability. In doing my own research, I studied survivor testimonials, historic news articles, and official records. It took me 2 years to pour through the information. I wept, I was angry, ridden with guilt, frustration. I particularly remember watching the film We Were Children, with my high school students as their cultural teacher. I was 6 months pregnant with my second child, an Indigenous child who would be born with the same beautiful brown skin that his father has. I could not contain my emotion, as I can't right now. My baby seemed more and more like a miracle, the descendant of survivors. Excuse me. My sons have never met their great-grandparents. They died too young. We called them survivors because they came from Shubenacadie, alive, when so many did not. However, the nightmare of their experiences would follow them, would continue to eat away at their soul, would be present in their parenting style, in their substance abuse, in their domestic violence, in their internalized racism, in their pain. The discovery of the remains of 215 innocent children is beyond devastating. Canada, apologies, payouts, even days of recognition will never be enough. 215 families were given no answers about their babies, some as young as 3 years old, the same age as my youngest child. When we have senators, Leaders of political parties and everyday Canadians suggesting that these schools had good intentions, weren't all bad, or were a product of the times. I say, how dare you? Systemic murder, often in front of other children, followed with threats and intimidation, and a disgusting cover-up with the use of mass graves, forged records, and death certificates. This is not an isolated incident for this school. One child's death and erasure are criminal, despicable. 215, with the potential of more grave sites across Canada to be found now more likely than ever, is genocide. We are so quick to step on our pedestal and wave our fingers at other countries for their transgressions, when our stool may well sit on the graves of Indigenous children killed by church and state right here in Canada. Shame. Shame. There is no apology in the world that will take this pain away. There has been a lot of talk of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples in Canada, but truth must come first, and the truth is that most Canadians have no idea of the full impact of residential schools, the residual effects, and the intergenerational trauma. Bill C-5 is a necessary step to fulfill a recommendation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and to bring much needed awareness to the horrors of the past, as well as those that continue. Make no mistake, missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit peoples is part of this legacy. Joyce Etchicon's death is part of this legacy. Chantel Moore's death is part of this legacy. A National Day of Reconciliation is only as good as the space it creates for truth. Truth about what has been and truth about what is. I fully support Bill C-5, and I stand with my colleagues in this House today to see that it becomes law. It is long overdue. It is reactive rather than proactive, however. For those children and their families, please, we must do better. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The honourable member, the honourable député de Berthier-Mascouche.
The honourable member for Berthier-Mascouche.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I'd like to thank our colleague for the Green Party for her speech. It was very touching. We share part of her emotions today. I don't know if that's of any comfort, but I was wondering, I'd like to ask the question that I asked earlier. What is the path towards reconciliation? This recognizing this day is unanimous in the House, but to ensure reconciliation, for it to really happen, we can't be paternalistic. We have to make sure that they can make their own decisions for us to live in a real partnership, and I'd like to hear what she has to say about that. The honourable member for Fredericton.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my honourable colleague for that question. And absolutely, the legacy of paternalism continues. I very boldly voted against Bill C-15, and I know it came as a shock for a lot of people, but it was a protest. It was because we still have the Indian Act in Canada. Those parents of those children were unable to seek legal counsel because it was illegal in our country to do so. So we have not done the work of reconciliation, and to pass a bill to say that it may happen, with a stroke of a pen is irresponsible, and it continues that paternalistic approach. Indigenous communities have the capacity, they have the leadership to determine their own fates. They must be given the resources that they need to do that, and that is the way forward. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for her speech. And I know I worked for the government of Saskatchewan when they dedicated a Indian industrial school a cemetery to be a provincial historic site, and how powerful that ceremony was, and the memory of those lives that were lost in unmarked graves there. It is a tragic part of our history. So I thank the member for bringing this forward, and I'm glad to see that we can see that this is passed. And I just wanted to make more of a comment than a question, but thank the member for her speech.
Member for Fredericton.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank very much my colleague for those kind words. I mentioned my role as a teacher, and I worked at a middle school here in the city of Fredericton, where outside is a very famous large cemetery. It's from members of the community from days gone by, but the children often make comments about looking outside and how sad it is to see a cemetery, rather than say a playground or something more uplifting. And the truth is, for so many children in residential schools, that was the reality. Every school had a graveyard. That reality alone should shock us all into action. The action is the key. So we can be as upset as we want, we can be as moved as we want, but unless those actions follow, we are still failing. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
It's the honourable member for Vancouver East.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I just want to say thank you so much to the members. Very thoughtful and heartfelt speech. Just exactly to the point around action. What we know is that there is such delay in implementing the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls calls for action. The government promised that, in fact, they would deliver on that last year, and still we're nowhere near. I wonder if the member could comment on that. Should the pandemic be an excuse to say that that's why there's a delay, or is it the opposite, because the pandemic, that we need to actually step up on the action?
The honourable member for Fredericton.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank so much my honourable colleague for that question. And you're right, there's no justification for inaction on the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's file. And if anything, the pandemic exacerbated issues specifically for women or for vulnerable communities, and to see that we're potentially using that as an excuse it's beyond upsetting. We also failed to follow through with the recommendations from the Royal Commission. We follow through with the recommendations from the TRC. We've ticked off a couple, but we're nowhere near what we need to achieve. So it's just, I'm so frustrated. And again, I have to just mention C-15, and that's really, I hope people can understand what I was trying to do with that. And it's to educate. We're not there yet. We have to continue these really difficult conversations. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
I'll allow for a brief question. The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to my dear friend and colleague from Fredericton for a very important speech. I noted her reference to Chantel Moore, and I want to ask her, Chantel Moore being a young woman from Vancouver Island, from Newtowneth Territory, who was killed in the area where the honourable member for Fredericton lives and works. Is there any update? Has her family been given any information about how she was murdered in the course of a wellness check?
A brief answer from the member for Fredericton.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my honourable colleague for bringing up this issue. I have to say her name as many times as I can. Chantel Moore, her family, they deserve answers, they deserve justice, and our province can no longer sit on that report. It has been completed for some time now, and they need to see every cross T and dotted I of what went into what happened that night. And we need to look across Canada about what wellness checks bring on, what kind of threats it brings to people of color, to Indigenous people across this country. We continue to fail. Thank you, Madam Speaker.